Thank you for hanging in through the afternoon. Appreciate you're still here. I realise I'm one of the few people between you and the reception, so I'll try to be quick. So, since I had a pretty good idea of what Jeff was going to say, because I was his deputy director for the first 5 years he was here, and I had a pretty good idea what Bob was going to say, I thought I'd try to say something a little different. So, the subject is sustainable development. And I think we all know what development is. And the phrase sustainable development, development is the noun, it's the subject of what we're talking about. Sustainable is a modifier. Development, we know, is improvement in human well-being, the effort to improve human welfare. We might argue about what the metrics of measurement for well-being and welfare are, but I don't think there's any argument that we want to improve it. GDP or GDP per capita, we heard from the panel that discussed economics, might not be the best way to measure it, but however you measure it, we want to improve human well-being. The problem with something like GDP per capita is that it's a measure of what's going on right now. It has no intertemporal measurement to it. So we might be developing very well right now, but it says nothing about how we're going to develop in the future. Sustainable development concerns itself with the future of development. Can the countries that are well developed now maintain that level of development? Can poor countries achieve development? Can rapidly developing countries continue to develop at that rapid rate? I think we heard from the panel that rapidly developing countries probably can't continue and maybe never intended to continue to develop at the rate they were initially. Sustainability, it turns out, is harder to measure than development. How do you know that you're doing something that's sustainable? How do you know you're doing something that's unsustainable? How do you know that present consumption is a problem? How do you know that it's going to be improved in the future? And until recently, there was a significant debate, a significant conflict between how an economist would measure sustainability and how an ecologist or an environmentalist might measure. Some of the key ideas have been around growth, consumption, and the more unusual idea of substitution. Economists will typically tell you that growth is good, that we've been doing this since the Industrial Revolution, that we must consume in order to grow, and we must consume in order to maintain just exactly where we are. And that there is this idea that you can substitute your way out of economic problems. So over the years, we've substituted transportation by horses with gasoline, with something new. We've substituted candles with paraffin lamps, with electric light. So the notion is that you can always find, through human innovation, some way of improving things to substitute for the deficiencies you might have. So Partha Dasgupta, who's my favorite economist, has summarized this by saying that economists generally believe that increases in knowledge and manufactured in human capital will enable societies to substitute their way out of economic problems. You can always substitute your way out of it. Ecologists, on the other hand, generally think that there are many natural assets that we depend on for our livelihoods that we cannot or should not deplete to the point where we have to think about substituting for them. If a species goes away, it's gone forever. You can't substitute a lost species. So ecologists will tend to think that the idea of substitution doesn't work for ecosystems. What's more, environmentalists will tell you that some of the things we've cleverly substituted have very significant effects on the future of the planet. Bob emphasised the problems with CO2 emissions. So we may have been clever enough to substitute out horsepower for the use of fossil fuels, but it comes with significant consequences. There may be a meeting ground, and I'm very encouraged by this. If we start thinking about sustainability criteria and the sort of formulation that Ken Arrow and others have done, in which we think about consumption as being okay, but in order for consumption to be sustainable, and this is a quote now, current consumption must be consistent with an investment being made in the future so that future generations can enjoy standards of living at least as high as our own. So the idea is you can consume all you like, so that so long as you're doing it, you're investing in the future in such a way that future generations can also consume. And a key to this is to recognize that the capital that's being either acquired or assumed comes in three forms. There's manufactured capital, and we know what that is. Human capital, which is the growth of knowledge and innovation and insight, and natural capital. And the thing that's been missing for most of the discussion among economists and among ecologists is the natural capital. Natural capital has until quite recently been left out, and the sum of these three is called genuine wealth. You don't have genuine wealth just through manufactured capital or just through human capital. You get genuine wealth, and you use genuine wealth through those three types: human capital, manufactured capital, and natural capital. The surprising thing is, to many people, that if you make a sustainability criterion using those three, and you examine countries against that criterion, it turns out that countries like the US, Europe, and China pass the sustainability criterion easily. And then countries like places like sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and North Africa fail terribly. They're losing genuine capital at a huge rate. India, Pakistan, Nepal, and even Bangladesh are really borderline. The problem is not that those countries are consuming too much. The problem is that they're investing too little in the future. Countries can consume but invest in the future. If you're consuming little but investing even less in the future, you're failing a sustainability criterion, that one at least, that Arrow and colleagues invented. Okay, into climate change. We know that climate change is going to be global, but it's going to be extremely uneven globally. It's going to be severe in some places and less severe in others in its physical form. We also know that the world is uneven in its development status. Some people are doing quite well, some people are doing very poorly by whatever metric you use. So what happens is that an uneven physical phenomenon is laying itself down on an equally uneven world. And the possibility then is the amplification of development deficits in some places, the increase in development gains in others. But the convolution of the two is the outcome of an uneven physical phenomenon on an uneven world. So let's think about that in its geographic context, because there is a geographic expression to this. We know that the physical phenomena of climate change are going to be greatest in the high latitude regions, the northern polar regions in particular. And we see it happening right now. But these are the places where there aren't very many people. There are precious ecosystems that ought to be preserved, but there aren't many people there. What's more, I think economists would argue that the lifestyles they're living are substitutable. They live in close harmony with the environment. They live in close need of the natural resources that are there. But there's no doubt that they could live a different way. They could take up a different sort of lifestyle. Now, on the basis of human rights, which I would agree with, they have the right to the livelihood that they have. On the basis of many other considerations, ethical and value considerations, they have the right to stay the way they are. But as a development issue, they could substitute themselves out of that problem. In the temperate zones, which is where we are in the US and where we are here, the changes will be large, but we have extremely high manufactured capital and we have extremely high human capital. So many of the losses that one might experience can be substituted out by different types of advancement in capital. It won't be nice, it won't be pleasant. We won't like to see the ecological changes that we will see, but in principle at least, we can probably deal with them because of our wealth and our ability to innovate. I'm not suggesting it's a good idea, I'm just saying that with that sort of formulation, we can probably deal with it. It's the low latitude regions, sub-Saharan Africa, the humid and arid tropics, that are in the greatest possibility of problems here for sustainability. The problem is not that they're consuming too much. The problem is that they live so close to the environment, they have so little human capital accumulation, they have so little manufactured capital accumulation, that even very small changes in the natural capital are not substitutable. They don't have any way to get out of it. That means that those regions which failed the Arrow criterion in the first place, in the event of climate change, will just see themselves in greater distress. So it comes out in an odd sort of way, where the physical changes are largest, the social changes may be the least. Where the physical changes are the smallest, the social changes are likely to be largest. Okay. How does this play into rapid development? Well, I think in terms of rapid development, there is lessons to be learned in terms of natural disasters. And in this, I'm going to tell you a tale of two cities. Think about what a natural disaster is. It's a massive macroeconomic shock, just like the financial crisis. But what it will do is destroy all three types of capital. Humans are lost, manufactured capital is lost, and natural capital is lost, all in one blow. You don't lose one or the other, everything goes together. So the way in which you cope with it or respond to it depends on the mix, how much of these things you have. So let me tell you about two places, two different natural disasters, which I'll argue is different in some ways in their appearance, but very similar in another. I'll talk a little bit about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005, a little bit about the Sichuan earthquake last year in China. I'm going to argue that they're similar in their origins, though different in their expressions. They're similar in that the human toll was very large and very unusual. In Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, at least 2,000 people died. A typical hurricane in the US will kill nobody, or maybe a handful of people, 10 or 20. The hurricane in New Orleans took as many deaths as what happened in the Galveston flood in the year 1900, roughly the same. So it's the worst thing that's happened in modern history in the US in a natural disaster. The earthquake in Sichuan last year was also unusually large in the numbers. A declining population for many years, and the only economic growth is in the gambling casinos and other tourist attractions. Poverty made the people of New Orleans vulnerable, but what did it make them vulnerable to? They were vulnerable to the impact of an engineering failure. What put them at risk was the levees on the canals. Now, be very clear about this because a lot of people are not. These are not the levees that held back the Mississippi River. These were the levees around industrial canals that are used for commerce. They take shipping from the Mississippi River, cut it across the poor neighborhoods of New Orleans, and send it out to the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. This is not levees designed to hold back the natural flow of a river. These are levees designed to support commerce. They were built there through those poor neighborhoods in the 1914-15 sort of era, in a time when growth was rapid in the US. They are the product of a rapid growth period in the US, a time when you just had to have conduits of commerce, and they were put through the poor parts of New Orleans for that reason. They were never built well, they were always neglected. So what happened was that the vulnerability of New Orleans in 2005 was actually acquired nearly a century earlier. Living in the shadow of poverty put the people in New Orleans at great risk, but living in the shadow of the levees pretty much sealed their fate. Sichuan's provincial capital of Chengdu is also a place of great vulnerability, but the vulnerability is newly acquired. It's not old. Rapid development has led to a substantial in-migration that was mentioned earlier. The change of 80% to 60% farmers is accompanied by the equal change in urbanization. Rapid development requires the rapid growth of cities. Rapid growth comes with its own risks. People compromise when they build quickly, and this happens all over the world. In New York, we're constantly hearing of crane collapses and building problems that are all associated with rapid growth. The high death toll in the Izmit earthquake in Turkey in 1999 is all associated with poor building construction. Almost all of it can be traced to that, the rapid construction to accommodate rapid growth. The buildings in Sichuan are different in appearance and purpose, of course, but they're really different in the same way. Earthquakes don't kill people, buildings kill people. And sadly, that's exactly what happened in Sichuan last year. Chengdu and New Orleans are twin cities in a sense. The tragedy of both cities lies in engineering compromises directly tied to rapid growth. Where they may differ, and I hope they differ, is in how they may grow out of the tragedy. New Orleans is in decline. It had a great opportunity to rebuild out of the ruins of Katrina into a better city, but instead the city today is poorer and more divided than it ever was. The poor areas are still laid waste, and the only improvements have been in the areas which are already in fine condition to begin with. And all of this is a complete derivative of what government action can do in the wake of a disaster. It's probably too early to tell whether Chengdu will grow strongly out of the tragedy of the earthquake, but the opportunity exists. The Chinese economy is strong and growing still, and the country is large, so that that scale itself can buffer the effects of the tragedy. Capital flows can be directed from other regions, so that the region itself need not be responsible for its own rebuilding. This too is part of the government action, and planning, as was described in an earlier talk, is the essential way of making this happen. Rapidly developing countries like China are in a sense caught in the middle between rich and poor, and their vulnerability shows characteristics of both. And in a sense, because of that, they can be trampled by disaster, or they can be the beneficiaries of the rebirth that comes after all of these sorts of tragedies. I certainly hope and believe that it's possible that Chengdu and China as a whole can be examples of how disaster, financial or natural, can be followed by a new flowering. And I very much hope that happens.